Okay, so thank you everybody for hanging in here with us. I know these days are long, but man, these panels have been amazing. While we're waiting for everybody, I just want to give one quick plug. If you think the policy work going on right now on mass incarceration here at Brown is awesome, you need to check out the archive work that's happening at the John Hay. We just acquired the largest archive of a currently incarcerated person in the nation, Mumia Abu Jamal. And we worked really hard. Some of the students you saw speaking here have been part of that work, that archival work, which is also a collection priority called The Voices of Mass Incarceration. 100 oral histories, 100 letters and poems, and art created by people that are currently incarcerated, as well as 40 letters from solitary confinement that are within the state of Rhode Island and presently under those conditions. And thank you to Sam Wave real quick, who really facilitated that. The students are archiving that work, but also are testifying in Rhode Island to change the conditions. So this is where a sleepy archive meets policy work and activism and all of it. So we got great things. Talk to Sam about it, talk to me. I want to introduce this next panel. The panel is called Politics, Punishment, and Reform. We got Brandon Elston, Assistant Professor of Sociology from The Ohio State. I put the in there, is that right?
Yes, Sade agrees, so.
People get salty, okay? I'm from Northwestern. We don't say that all the time. I'm just doing it out of respect. Brittany Friedman, because I like you both. Brittany Friedman, Assistant Professor of Sociology, University of California. Felix Owusu, did I say it okay? Owusu? Mostly? Okay. Wow, I have a touch of dyslexia. I get very nervous. We have Amber Powell. Oh, I'm sorry. Felix is as a postdoctoral scholar from the Haas School of Business at the University of Berkeley, California, Berkeley. And we have Amber Powell, who is Assistant Professor of Sociology and Criminology at the University of Iowa. I'm Nicole Gonzalez Van Cleve. I'm a colleague with John Eason. It is truly my honor to be his friend and colleague. And I have to say that when I came here and I was all by myself for like 1 year, I dreamt of this type of community. And look, we've manifested it, right? So we're all here. Thank you. Let's get started. I'm so excited. Oh, sure.
All right, thank you everyone. I appreciate the mic. I'm a walker too, like Sade, so helps me out. So the title of my talk that I'm going to spend some time talking with you all about today is Recording the Police, Police Contact, Cell Phones, and Violence. So just to give a brief overview of what I'll be able to talk with you all here today about is cell phone recording the police, my theoretical intervention, recognizing camera cues. I'll talk a little bit about the setting and methods where I conducted my study, talk about one of the broader research questions in my research agenda, and then I'll spend most of my time talking about a few of the findings and then the key interventions and policy implications and conclude with my contributions. So when I started this research, I ended up conducting this interview with Kevin, who's a 42-year-old resident. And one of the things that he said very early on was that he only recorded police when he believed that they would instigate criminal charges against him and his neighbors. So he ended up saying, I feel comfortable recording for future reference. It's just in case they prepare criminal acts against us in the community. So one of the things that really cued me into something that was happening in this data set was this notion of just in case and also future reference. So this led me to start thinking about my actual intervention, which is recognizing camera cues. So one aspect of my research really investigates when and where Black men deploy their cell phones to record police misconduct and abuse, and what I term recognizing camera cues. So in routine encounters, residents learn to interpret officers' words and actions as symbols of police misconduct. In subsequent exchanges, residents interpret officers' words and actions as signals to record police misconduct. So in recognizing camera cues, residents learn to interpret and anticipate police misconduct and violence. So I'll get into some of the findings and then I'll touch on some of the policy implications. So I conducted this research in the Englewood neighborhood of Chicago, which is located on the south side of the city or southwest side of the city, depending on who you're talking to. It's a predominantly Black and impoverished and low income community that has experienced decades of divestment, which is the reason why it's in the current state that it is now. I conducted a number of interviews, but the research that I'm talking about today draws on 27 interviews with 23 black men who actually had recorded police at the time of the interview. So this project really emerges from one of the central questions in my research agenda, which is how do frequent targets of policing contest police surveillance and violence? So camera cues are building off of the idea that frequent interactions with police enable residents to develop expectations that past patterns will repeat in subsequent interactions. So they did this in two different ways: hearing police officers in strategic ways and also seeing police officers in strategic ways. So one interviewee I had, his name was Chris. He's a 22-year-old resident, and he described how officers' words and demeanors acted as indicators of officers' capacity for violence. So he said, I was walking, and they had asked me, come here. And I'm like, what y'all stopping me for? I ain't do nothing. I'm walking to the store. They like, bring your dumb black ass here. This was a racist police officer. And I kept walking, and he calls out, I will tase your ass. So I stopped because I'm not finna get tased. They just checked me for no reason. They let me go. So what's important here is that Chris deduces after the officer uses racialized language that this is a racist police officer who will likely engage in police violence, right? So he anticipates that he actually will be tased. And what's also a precursor to this is that he actually has been tased by a police officer and experienced a similar encounter to this one prior to this experience. In a subsequent experience, he's a bystander, and he recalled recording a police officer after he heard an officer shout an obscenity at another resident. So he said, get the fuck out the car, and I was recording on the side. So we can see here that immediately as the police officer says, shout some obscenities, it cues Chris in to actually record. And he ends up capturing all this police abuse on camera. So he says the man got his hands out. He smacked the man first, and then he put him in cuffs. The man wasn't doing nothing. All he did was run a stinking stop sign. He got so aggressive with the man, put him up against the car. He smashed his head. Ain't nothing but a stop sign. Y'all acting like I ran somebody over. Shut the fuck up and stop talking. And I was recording the whole time. So this really maps onto what we see a lot of time when we hear about public discourses of these cell phone generated videos that capture police misconduct and violence, and really focusing on how ordinary residents and citizens are able to capture police misconduct on camera compared to what we usually hear about in the academic literature, which is usually organized activists. So I also had Craig, who was a 29-year-old resident and bystander and recorded police during an impending home raid of his neighbor. And Craig has experienced very similar police encounters that allowed him to interpret and anticipate police actions. So in the first, he said, I see police and hear them say, bring your little dumbass here. I'm going to still listen even though I don't have to. Now I know you're one of them petty police officers. In another encounter, he goes on to say, they was making it seem like they were going to shoot. They were like, bring your ass out here before I shoot. That's when I got to recording. And I'm like, let me record this shit just in case this police officer do shoot them. So here we can see the parallelism in the statements and the experiences. Bring your little dumbass here. Bring your ass out here before I shoot. The second time is coupled with the threat of violence. So Craig knows to treat this as significant. So the key intervention. So the findings really show how police stops and searches are deeply impactful sites of social interaction, influencing black men's strategies of resistance. Police contact becomes a site for police misconduct and violence, which influences black men to develop distrustful perceptions of legal actors. So this leaves us with a question: if black residents can predict and anticipate police misconduct, they must frequently experience similar police interventions. So now I want to talk a little bit about the social problems that are implicated by my research. So one, I think we need to really establish that police are gatekeepers for the criminal legal system, and also a distinct system that oppresses black Americans in particular. So by being the gatekeepers, they lead to the entirety of the carceral state, the criminal legal system, prison industrial complex, whatever language that you want to use. And this becomes particularly important when we start thinking about intensified police contact. So one of the things that enables residents in my study to predict police misconduct is the fact that they are actually experiencing high volumes of involuntary police contacts, right? And so the question becomes, how can we decrease low-income black residents' contact with the police? A second but equally important question and social problem is, how can we decrease low-income black residents' contact with police misconduct and violence? So I want to talk a little bit about the policy context in Chicago And stop and frisk, of course, is an immensely huge piece of this. And police unevenly enact stop and frisk in low-income Black communities, which we know when controlling for crime and other demographic factors. But what's also important is that stop and frisk is the leading organizational strategy for police departments in Chicago. So we have these abrasive investigative encounters that are a common experience for many Black residents, particularly on the south and west sides of the city. What's also important is that there's been other policies that have been on the books that have substantiated this same outcome. So in 2013, Mayor Rahm Emanuel launched Operation Impact, which is a proactive policing strategy that was launched in the neighborhood where I conducted my research and 19 other neighborhoods that city officials labeled as high crime. And what's important here is that of the 7,230 officers that were authorized through this policy, 12% or 888 were assigned to Inglewood alone. So this is just one example of the type of policy mechanisms that are also working in tandem with the larger organizational strategy of stop and frisk. And this is one example historically that endows legal actors with increased discretion, particularly targeting all residents in these low-income Black communities, so it's not just people who are likely to engage in criminal activity. So one of the things that has kind of changed as we've had some of these conversations today, even I think particularly on the panel around abolition as policy, is thinking about how can we think about reallocating funding from the police to other life-affirming institutions. So while this was a trend in some states, Illinois has not followed this trend. So while they have increased funding for economic development and civic inclusion, they have maintained the enormous budget for police, right? And so when we're thinking about moving towards abolition, we're thinking about playing the long game. How can we think about decreasing the police budget and using those same funds for life-affirming institutions? And you can see here in this graph the punitive investments in West Inglewood, which there's a distinction, of course, between West Inglewood and Inglewood on the neighborhood maps in Chicago, but residents don't always experience it that way. And we can see the enormous number here of 197 million that has been used to invest in terms of punitive investments, right? So what I'm talking about is investing and taking that same money to create life-affirming institutions that have the resources to actually actualize their vision. So I also want to talk a little bit about what has been happening with police violence in Chicago. So there's been a few torture scandals in Chicago and other cities as well that have come to the light. In particular, Chicago Police Commander John Burge and his legion of officers, referred to as the Midnight Crew, used suffocation, shock, and sexually abusive techniques to extract confessions from over 100 Black men for about 2 decades. And recently they received a reparations settlement for about $5.5 million. Some of the torture survivors are actually in my study. And so they talk about this payment and how it actually is not leading up to all of the harm and violence that they actually experienced. And really becomes important for how we think about abolition and moving towards that. So some of these reparations have been seen as the leading paradigm for how to address police violence. One of the key problems here is that all of these things are retroactive, right? So now we have the Chicago Torture Justice Center. Great. It's really also assuming that the police will continue to engage in misconduct, violence, and torture, and that then we will send them to have counseling. We will send them to have education. We will give you a nice settlement, but it does nothing to actually prevent all of the violence that police officers engage in. And we know that one of the fundamental ways that police officers operate is as violence workers. That's what they are trained to do. So we really can't expect anything else when they do what they were trained to do. So I want to conclude with some suggestions for how we can actually actualize this vision, thinking about Chicago and thinking about some of the research that I've been doing. So one, police violence prevention policies. So this is not meant to be prescriptive, but rather a provocation, right? So how can we think about preventing police violence in the short term as we are thinking about the long-term goal of abolition? So policy has attempted to address the extremes of police violence, so police torture. We also have to reckon with the routine ways that police officers facilitate violence. So through the stop and search, strip searches that become very common on the actual street level, which I know surprises some people, but it's something that I continue to hear a lot when I'm conducting research. And then also policies that address these policies that have been on the books, right? So not just the large torture rings and scandals, but also policies like Operation Impact, right? That increase the suspicion and interactions with Black residents in Inglewood and other low-income Black communities in Chicago. And then lastly, thinking about reducing police contact, so reallocating funding from the police to pro-social institutions and ongoing community efforts. So in the community where I conduct my research, they are now launching a Buy Back the Block initiative, which is really to talk about the larger historical context of divestment in this community, and really to be able to utilize Black resources to be able to ensure that the community is creating itself and sustaining itself for the actual people that live there. So I think having these things in on a larger scale is really important, right? So if we took that 197 million and invested that in buying back the block, investing in local community groups that develop programming to address safety, I think we'll be in a lot better place to moving towards abolition as the end game. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Am I loud enough? Oh, I gotta. No, I'm not really a mover. I'm a mover like this. Yeah, I'll move her up. Okay. She said to move it up. Move it up. Okay, like that. We can hear you pretty good. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I want to say thank you very much, John, or I was going to say Easton, but I only call you John, so I'll say thank you very much. Thank you, John, for the invitation. Today has been so fruitful, and so I'm just really grateful to be here amongst all of you, and I've enjoyed everyone's presentations. It was wonderful. So I will be talking a bit about my forthcoming book, but mainly focusing on the sort of the ethos that it was more of a call for an investigative ethos in terms of how we do social science work. And so my forthcoming book, Carceral Apartheid, How Lies and White Supremacists Run Our Prisons, opens with one premise. And that is that most major institutions in our lives are built on lies. If we take a closer look and allow ourselves to truly see into the heart of our society, we see that at each turn and within each pillar institution, whether it be education, health, or criminal justice, there lives a mountain of coordinated disinformation, meaning a network of people in positions of power who are deliberately withholding the truth in order to misrepresent the actual purpose of their institution. In Carceral Apartheid, I document the government's war on Black communities as manifested within our prison system. I track a historical through line that is deployed to achieve a state-backed victory in both society and prisons, where joint efforts between white civilians and law enforcement work together to suppress Black collective action and the right to our freedom. Our prisons are a microcosm where this phenomenon becomes entrenched and escalates, particularly during heightened moments of collective organizing. And so I begin by tracing the rise of the Adjustment Center in California prisons in the 1950s, which are a series of isolation and behavioral adjustment units. And it's a significant practice that is talked about heavily within activist discourse during the time, but it is largely left out of, with the exception of one law review article I was able to find it is largely left out of the empirical scholarly discourse in terms of really discussing the impact of the Adjustment Center and its rise in the 50s. And it's mostly just because we didn't have much data on the Adjustment Center. Well, I do, and I dug it up as a nosy researcher, if you will. And I had some great leads from some scholars who were like, maybe you should go digging here. And I went and did it and found it. And so I dug it up in an archive to be able to show that the origin of California's effort to identify, surveil, torture, and disappear Black people, they identified as threatening into the darkest and most secretive corners of their prisons. And so, like the federal government, who they worked with closely, actually, they adopted a warfare-like logic and deployed it behind bars through official means, such as the Adjustment Center is one example, but also extra-legal means, which I document through snitch jacketing, meaning labeling someone as a snitch and so that they will face consequences, through arranging gladiator fights between people that they would like to see either as punishment to one and often to take out an intended target. And then also aligning with what would become the Aryan Brotherhood in California. And most often carrying out these activities in a clandestine manner as though they were thinking of themselves like they're the prison version of the CIA. And so in my work, I found evidence of California prison officials sharing their techniques, so sharing information with other state prison systems via letters, responding to their letters for help with their, quote, troublesome Black problem, end quote, naming self-described Black militants or those seeking to liberate Black people from this battle that they did not start. And significantly, the coordination that I'm describing happened preemptively, prior to anything prison officials could have described as a major disturbance. Instead, they identified their enemy as self-described Black militants and the growing Black prison population and would stop at nothing to see them subdued. I conclude my book in the present day as incarcerated people across races and affiliations united in hunger strikes off and on for over the past decade in collective protest against decades of war deliberately fueled by the top and their officers, all of which crystallized in its origin, which I show with a desire to destroy the growing Black population amidst the rising civil rights movement. And so my work in this area has several implications for policy and abolition as practiced. And so the first that I will talk about is data rights and access to the truth. As we know, people have risked their lives, people have survived torture, been imprisoned, and died to save information that the state has sought to destroy. Truth-telling as method is a practice of discovery, of rebuilding that which has been attacked, and digging in the dark corners of our society to reveal the hidden. Black feminists have been doing this work for centuries, weaving together histories and creating methods for revolution. Truth-telling as method has taught me that without access to key records and oral histories, the state can prevent us from fully theorizing the reality of racist intention that is rooted in the operation of entire systems and institutions rather than solely the individual racism of a few bad actors. And so I think about this often. If we could hear the backroom conversations, if we could see the secret letters, if we could see covert emails, then we wouldn't be debating the theoretical necessity of centering racist intent, even in a society, a contemporary world that purports to be colorblind. And so, for example, when whistleblowers exposed emails that proved the mid-2010s coordinated effort by government officials to poison the water of Black communities in Flint, Michigan, or when whistleblowers leaked hidden correspondence and directives proving the orchestration, in part by the Centers for Disease Control, of the Tuskegee syphilis study. Once again, the deliberate destruction and declaration of war by the state on the Black community was revealed in the light of truth. Cover-ups, clandestine activities, whistleblowers, and intentionality should be central to our social science understanding of racism in the United States as foundational to the continual facilitation of imperialism. And so as scholars, truth-telling as a method is a process of catharsis. It's really just rising lies up from the dead, and dreaming of a new reality in their wake. And so as social scientists, our work is to really also aid in the reckoning which occurs as a result of truth-telling. And I was thinking as I was writing about this for today, that as a mentee and how mentorship does play a very big role in this. And so as a mentee of sociologist John Hagan, and there's a few of us in here, so there's Heather, Brandon, and Nicole. But as a mentee of John, I know that we were all always encouraged to keep pushing and not back down, which is seen in his co-authored book on police torture and cover-ups in Chicago that Brandon was discussing, that were organized by Chief Burge and Mayor Daley. And also it has been influential, the mentorship of sociologist Alden Morris, who constantly told me to reject how others project fear onto my work and try to categorize it in certain ways. And he said, no, for example, I remember presenting and having someone say, oh, you're just talking about prison gangs. And we got into a theoretical debate, and Alden said, your theorizing is exactly what you're actually talking about the process by which that term actually becomes applied. So ignore them. Very helpful. And then also from the encouragement of Nicole, I have felt motivated to tell the truth about what I have discovered, despite knowing that those in positions of power will not like what I have to say, just as she does in her book to expose the real crooks of Cook County. And so through this mentorship, through friendships, through exchange, it has been significantly influential, and I think that it for me, in terms of staying in my power, and I think that it is very influential in supporting those who choose that path, which I think that we have that like-mindedness in this room. And so supporting the collective reckonings that are happening within our society is a key part of our methodological work. As social scientists, and building conscious communities who support this vision is essential to maintaining staying power and subverting white supremacist conventions where necessary, also in our disciplines. And so I will conclude, as I'm coming down in time. A second implication that I'd like to discuss of this work, and particularly of my book, is potentially aiding in the release of thousands of people, not just in California, but around the country, from long-term solitary confinement that actually stems from this racist legacy that I discuss. And it's a racist legacy also of eugenics and systemic corruption that is actually foundational for institutional procedures. So much so that it's difficult to call it corruption if that's actually how it runs normally. And so, for example, in 2009, there was a very well-known federal class action lawsuit, which is Ashker v. Governor of California, and it was filed in part by the Center for Constitutional Rights. It initiated a legal battle that lasted over a decade up until 2023, with also a series of cross-racially organized prison hunger strikes throughout. And so the goal is to protest prolonged solitary confinement as violating the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment and the absence of meaningful review for secure housing units or SHU placement, for those particularly in Pelican-based supermax, and how it violates due process. And so as of 2011, at that time, there were reports noting that nearly 750 people were held for 22 and a half hours per day in concrete windowless cells for more than a decade, and dozens for over 20 years. Plaintiffs in this class action actually described how their first experience with prolonged solitary confinement prior to being in the SHU was in the adjustment centers that I thoroughly describe in my book. And so the case ended up reaching settlement in 2015. However, in 2019 and 2022, the court ruled that constitutional violations were still persisting and ordered the Department of Corrections to be monitored. The department appealed, and in 2023, the rulings were reversed. Last fall, in September 2023, plaintiffs filed for what's called a rehearing en banc. I probably mispronounced it, but that's what it's called. To have this reversal reconsidered to order the California Department of Corrections to continue to be monitored. And so last fall, with that particular filing, myself, along with several other scholars, such as Karamet Ryder, who also writes in this area, and also longstanding activists that have been fighting this fight for decades, all came together and signed on to this request as amici scholars, and briefly summarized our research and advocacy on this issue to make the case that the court should reconsider the reversal, given the mountain of evidence that proves that the Department of Corrections is continuing with its same practices, even in the face of court rulings. But we learned, unfortunately, last October that our request was denied, and the Department of Corrections continues to evade monitoring around their use of long-term solitary confinement. And so now more than ever, we must continue to push the boundaries of investigative social science based on the premise that if we dig deep enough, we would find the lies that abound within our institutions. And these are lies that ruin lives, as the work that has been presented today has shown. And so I believe that this must be central to our work toward abolition as policy and practice, because we have a duty to see clearly, and in order to do that, we have to often investigate and fight to do so. And once we can see clearly, we should provide a safe community, as we're doing here today, for all of those who are committed to doing so, because this work of collective dreaming cannot be done alone. So, thank you.
All right. Everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Great. Really excited to be here. Thank you to all the organizers for including me. I'm going to spend I guess first I want to introduce myself. I'm Felix Owusu. I'm a postdoctoral scholar at UC Berkeley. My training is in public policy, so my PhD is in public policy, and in the fall I'll be starting as a professor of public policy at UC Berkeley. So I'm hanging out at business school, but my work is... Go Bears, right. So I just wanted to help you all understand where I sit, and I figured given the charge to focus on policy, I would and my training as a policy professional, I'm going to try and spend as little bit of the time as I can talking about my own research and as much as I can about the policy sort of lessons that I've gleaned from my experiences as a researcher and working in government today. So I will be sprinkling some sort of findings and anecdotes from my research throughout, but I'm going to try and focus mostly on sort of the takeaways that I'm getting in this context. I'm also an economist, and I'm not going to apologize for it, but I'm not going to show you regression figures either, which is why I don't have slides. Okay, so I've tried to organize this around 3 lessons or takeaways that I've sort of seen come up over and over in my work that I think will hopefully be hopeful as we think about sort of broader conversations about all the very specific and multifaceted areas that people have talked about today. I've learned a ton about areas that I was not even aware of, but I think hopefully these lessons still apply. So the first is that the criminal legal system is really complex and multifaceted, which is very basic to everybody in this room, I'm sure, given the research that everybody's been doing. But I think this has implications for how we think about reform, and specifically targeted reforms that look at a specific decision point, decision maker, or element of the criminal legal system as a site for change. And I definitely understand how, given political processes and other things going on in communities, often we strike where we can when the iron is hot and try and make sort of change when the window is available, right? But I think this is a lesson that we have to take to heart, because often not considering the reactions that we're going to see elsewhere in the criminal legal system, or even just more broadly in our communities, can mean that these policy changes that we think are going to have one effect might have very different outcomes than we expect, right? So this is a lesson that's been reinforced in my own research on what happens when district attorneys in particular use the discretion of their offices to advance an agenda of reform. And so I particularly look at these types of reforms taking place in Suffolk County, Massachusetts, as well as Durham County, North Carolina, in some ongoing research. And I won't go into that into too much detail, but one of the things that we found and that motivated this research is the sort of big gulf between the conversations about what people expected would happen after these kinds of prosecutorial reforms, and then what happens when you look at the data to try and figure out what are the changes that we're seeing in the level of punishment that's that's occurring, and what's the distribution of that punishment, right? And so we, despite a lot of the motivation for these policies coming from communities and DAs who do have a genuine interest, I believe, in reducing punishment, we tend to see pretty muted declines in punishment as a result of these policies, right, in multiple jurisdictions that we've looked at. That's not to say that's always the case, but the ones that we're able to get data on, we see much, I think if you ask people their priors on what the change would be, and then you showed them what it actually were, people tend to be quite surprised that they're, much smaller. These places tend to have the offenses that are supposed to be deprioritized. They continue to be prosecuted at pretty high rates, right? We also see evidence of substantial heterogeneity in how these policies are put into practice based on the characteristics of the defendants themselves and the cases that are coming into this place, right? This is particularly of concern given that many of these policies are motivated by concerns around racial disparities, and we're seeing that when these policies are being implemented in sort of this discretionary framework of get it where you can in the pipeline, that discretion is still showing up in ways that you might expect, right? And so we actually see discretion leading to widening racial disparities in some contexts, despite that being one of the explicit goals to address with these policies. And finally, we see really big differences in impact across jurisdictions, highlighting that the local context in these jurisdictions matter a ton, even if the policies on paper tend to look pretty similar and have very similar coalitions of people who support them, right? And so in our quest to try and understand all this difference, this divergence we're seeing, divergence from expectations, divergence across jurisdictions, a few things kept coming up. And this is one thing that I will say I'm very happy to be able to collaborate with folks who are qualitative researchers, because at the point where what we can learn from our administrative data set stops, things like being able to do interviews, detailed reviews of other kinds of sources from like news and other things that were going on in these communities, having community partners in each of the communities that we work with, I think have really helped us like understand some of the mechanisms at play in this place a little bit. And I want to give a shout out to my co-authors, people like Sandra Smith, who have been really great in terms of trying to broaden sort of the methods that we can bring to these questions. But we keep seeing a couple of things come up. And I mentioned already discretion, and that's like the discretion of the staff within the office. And so you might have a policy, but then there's a bunch of ADAs who have to actually deal with implementing these policies. They're people who have often been here before these policies, or the current elected person was there. They'll be here afterwards, right? And they have their own agendas, their own preferences, and their own beliefs about what should be happening. So that's one aspect of it. But we also heard time and time again opposition from elsewhere in the criminal legal system, and police in particular, right? Police can respond by either increasing or decreasing the nature and extent of their surveillance in different kinds of communities, and they can they can increase or decrease their arresting intensity, right? They can collect different evidence or submit different types of charges to the courts in terms of describing the conduct that's been going on to try and circumvent these policy changes that target certain kinds of behavior. And they have priorities themselves that might conflict with the DA. They might want to show that they're clearing lots of cases to show that they're being responsive to communities, concerns around public safety, right? And this is not even getting into things like broader political pressure. Living in the Bay Area, there was already a very big conversation, and the DA ended up being recalled because of these very big concerns. And there was a lot of concern that it was actually driven by people who aren't even in the state of California or living in the Bay Area who are have their own preferences on this. I know in Suffolk County, Senator Tom Cotton was essentially obsessed with DA Rollins for much of this this time period, and this person's not living in Massachusetts or working in this area, but had a very big role in here, right? So not considering these other kinds of ways that people can react, sort of, I think, is part of why we're seeing these divergences from what we hoped would happen and what we expect would happen. And so my takeaway from all of this is that targeted reforms can be helpful in various contexts, but they should also consider ramifications throughout the criminal legal system pipeline and beyond. And they need to take seriously interventions that just limit the scope and power of criminal legal system actors to undercut policy, right? And so I think this is like this is a point that has come up a couple times. Many of the policies that we understand today contribute to mass incarceration and contribute to racial disparities and contribute to expanded punishment, right? They were championed initially by reformers who thought that they might moderate the system, certain excesses of the system. So I won't go into all these details because several other folks have brought this up, whether we're thinking about the expansion of community supervision, whether we're thinking about gender-responsive care in prisons, whether we're thinking about technological alternatives to school resource officers. So many people have brought up examples of this, and this it just keeps going over, right? You can end up playing whack-a-mole, right, with a sort of system where you have these system actors whose preferences and their incentives haven't changed, right? So these people who are in the policing department or who are ADAs, right, you might have a reform, but unless we're sort of addressing the incentives or their preferences or their power, right, to actually obstruct policy and to circumvent policy that's being sort of organized around and democratically, in some cases, actually trying to be passed, we will continue to have this game of whack-a-mole, right? So I think just taking seriously interventions that limit the scope and power of the criminal legal system actors to act in opposition to policy, right? The idea that we have people in government who openly, regularly act in opposition to the policy that we are, as a community, coming up with, or is that the leadership is bringing to the fore, is a very serious concern and something that we can't really move forward unless we're able to address, is my take. So how am I doing on time? Not great at all. Okay, cool. Lesson 3 is really short, so lesson 2 is gonna hopefully be most of it. All right. So during my time at my PhD training, I also spent nearly 2 years embedded in Washington, D.C.'s local government, right? I was working as a data scientist in that context, working on sort of evaluating different public safety interventions and also data transparency. In that role, my main project was trying to improve and publicly release data on police stops in Washington, D.C. that are now available online. And I think in that process, working in government and trying to be a little bit closer to these conversations around how are people evaluating and deciding what kinds of policies that they're going to put their weight behind, one of the things that came up was conversations around comparing punishment and alternatives and the way that we have very different scales in mind when we talk about punishment related interventions versus alternatives, and different goalposts for evaluating whether they've achieved what they're supposed to have achieved, right? And so in this role, I worked out of police headquarters, for about half the time that I was, half the week I worked in police headquarters. I attended regularly these command staff meetings. I got, and sort of went on ride-alongs, I got an inside view of some of the types of and extensive carceral capacity investments that we were making regularly, and sort of seeing them as policy choices that we're making in these behemoth organizations, right? And a few quick takeaways from that experience is that, number one, stops represent a massive carceral investment, right? These traditional policing activities, we're talking about something like 80,000 stops in a city of less than 800,000 in Washington, D.C., right? And Black district residents face dramatically higher levels of surveillance. They make up less than half the district. It's a chocolate city, but not that chocolate. But they're, more than around 3/4 year over year of the stops, and it gets worse if you look at the least productive stops of people where there's no arrest, no warning, even no tickets or anything coming out of that. Those are overwhelmingly stops of Black people, right? This does not even get into the things like extensive targeted social media monitoring that primarily Black youth face. It doesn't get into technologies like ShotSpotter that do constant audio surveillance of high-risk neighborhoods. It doesn't get into things like the Summer Crime Prevention Initiative, where they, quote, target 4 to 6 high-crime neighborhoods to focus all available resources, utilize the latest crime-fighting technology, and call upon partner agencies and organizations to assist in a coordinated effort to eliminate violence in these areas. And the list goes on, right? These are all very specific policy interventions that you could think of them in this context. And so we hear about these things, and I remember I was excited to at least bring in conversations around alternatives to punishment as in type of intervention, a whole class of things that we should be considering. And one of the pieces of pushback I got initially as a bright-eyed researcher saying like, have y'all considered this? They were like, we tried that already and it didn't work. And so there was a lot of like resistance to going back down that road because they had tried it and it didn't work. And so I pushed a little bit more and tried to find out what was going on. And I found out that this was basically a sort of diversion program that they had kind of flirted with. And it, I think this came up before. It wasn't staffed around the clock, right? And so if you weren't coming in during working hours, if you were there on the weekend or at night, you couldn't access this program unless the officer was going to find something to do with you until it opened, which is just not a reasonable thing for officers on patrol to do when they're making an arrest. And so the program had low uptake and low impact, and so they discontinued it, right? And they said it didn't work. And I want to contrast this with an evaluation that I worked on of a more traditional law enforcement intervention in 2 minutes. Okay. So one of the things that I worked on in this context was trying to evaluate an increase in funding to the Crime Gun Intelligence Center. Crime Gun Intelligence Centers are multi-agency collaborations. The Metropolitan Police Department in DC collaborates with the ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. I wish, right? I know, right? The U.S. Attorney's Office and many other organizations to try and address basically gun violence. And so before I showed up, they got about $1 million to invest in increasing their capacity. And this was a place-specific investment. So this is in the 7th District of D.C., which is Southeast D.C. For any of y'all who have spent time there, it's not exactly Ward 8, but it's also not Ward 8. It includes Anacostia, and many other sort of like heavily black communities where this was a very specific localized investment. And so we did an evaluation of this that it's pre-registered and available online. I'm not going to get into the details of it, but the quick takeaway is we found no positive impact on any sort of law enforcement or public safety related outcome. We looked at reported crime. We looked at gunfire and gun violence, murder. Even had access to the ShotSpotter information. So if you were worried that people are not reporting changes in gun violence and there's a measurement problem, we actually had other ways to corroborate the level of gun violence going on in these communities. We found across the board no impacts, right? The only positive result we were able to report was we also did a survey of people who were using these programs themselves, the detectives essentially, and they reported that they liked them a lot and thought they were really effective at helping them address crime, right? But we were not able to pick that up at any point in our analysis of the research that we did using sort of all the data that were available, right? And so when we were trying to make sense of these results, which were not shocking to me or I think many people, one thing that came up over and over was like, oh, this shouldn't be surprising. This is a small drop in the bucket. MPD gets $500 million a year, right? And so is $1 million going to be the thing that changes the world? And we only looked for a couple of years afterwards. These things take time, right? Like we don't have, we haven't let this breathe for long enough yet. So that's why we're not finding things yet, right? But this is the standard that we're holding the alternatives to, right? And so we're only willing to consider alternatives that show, in many contexts, these positive results in these quantitative analyses of public safety outcomes at the community level, right? And I would suspect that most law enforcement investments and interventions would fail if we applied that level, level of research requirement of their demonstrated efficacy. They would fail, I think, if we applied that bar consistently, right? So in practice, we often rely on these statements from officers that say, like, yes, this was great. It was super helpful. Just regardless of what we're actually seeing in terms of changes in gun violence in the community to assess whether something's good. But then when we have sort of these other alternatives, things that actually do have lots of, I think, great research evidence behind them, we have all these questions and we have such a high bar and such a different goalpost, I feel like, in these conversations, right? And so as a researcher walking into these rooms, I feel like where we, the goalposts felt very, very different. And so I think the takeaway there is we need to try alternatives at scale and give them time to operate and improve and iterate, right? That's what we've done with our current set of solutions. And if we're going to try and assess how something compares to those things, we have to give them similar levels of investment, similar levels of room to operate, similar levels of time, and ability to iterate and improve. And then beyond that, we have to be honest about how effective our current approaches are, right? When we're trying to think about assessing whether we should try an alternative and how risky an alternative is. We invest heavily in surveillance and punishment right now. We still have issues with crime, right? And so when we think about alternatives, I think we have to be just sort of honest about where we are right now and what it takes to improve. I don't think it's that hard to improve over where we are in many contexts. And the last point, I know I'm out of time here, the lesson number 3, this is one that I think I always try and remind myself of. is that we have enough information to make substantial improvements already. I'm a researcher. I go places and I try and produce new knowledge, right? But that's so often not the thing that is holding people back from making change. Every single place I've been, there's people in these communities that have spent years already understanding and cataloging the things that would be needed to improve these contexts. And so, and I think there's also evidence that in many contexts, we know that punishment isn't the answer, and we operate with that understanding, right? It's just a question of why in very specific communities and very specific places do we default to punishment? Because it's not the idea that we always do this or we have no other frameworks or no other knowledge of how to do this. We see this across the world. We even see this within the country in different types of communities, right? And so I think just acknowledging that, like, when new information is actually the limitation and new research is needed versus when we need to just like actually listen to the people who've been saying the things for the longest time and have the courage to try something new is like the last lesson that I'll leave you with. Thank you.
All right, can you hear me? Okay. Wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amber Joy Powell, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology at the University of Iowa. And it's so wonderful to be here with you all. There's so many people in this room whose work I've read, and it's just wonderful to just be in the room with you all and to talk about ways to end incarceration. So for the past 4 years, I've been conducting qualitative research on sexual victimization within both youth and adult detention facilities. And so this project is really born out of my broader commitment as a Black feminist criminologist and as a former sexual assault victim advocate to address the needs of incarcerated survivors. And these are survivors that have been marginalized in both the mainstream feminist organizing as well as those who have been on the periphery of policy conversations about the detrimental impact of carceral contact. So we know that historically, survivors across all institutional contexts have faced questions about their credibility and victim blaming, but this is particularly true for incarcerated survivors. Because they oftentimes exist within these correctional cultures that deem them hypersexual, violent, and manipulative as people that are always trying to get over on staff. So in addition to the fact that we have societal jokes where we make fun of prison sexual victimization with things like "don't drop the soap," and it becomes sort of a cultural point of humor for folks. What we find is that along with their legal status, their race, their gender, and sexuality, these are all reproducing notions that the sexual suffering of incarcerated people is something that is just a part of the punishment. It's a necessary evil. So that brings me to some of the policies that people have put in place to address sexual violence in prison. So in 2003, we see the passing of what we call the Prison Rape Elimination Act, or PREA, and this was a set of guidelines that was supposed to detect, prevent, and respond better to sexual misconduct. So in addition to placing restrictions on cross-gender strip searching and ensuring that staff and residents are being trained in PREA education and how to report, what PREA really does is creates this internalized grievance system for people to be able to report sexual misconduct. That's what it's supposed to do. And then in turn, staff are supposed to ensure that they're following the investigation protocols, that they're protecting survivors from retaliation, and that they're imposing these disciplinary measures in the case that somebody is found responsible for sexual misconduct, which is extremely rare. So while some have touted PREA as a sort of win for victim advocacy, I think the question remains, does PREA actually make incarcerated communities safer? And I'm guessing most of you will kind of know what the answer to that is. So this leads to two key questions that my project explores. Number one is really thinking about the ways that incarcerated communities, as well as those who are tasked with supporting them, so victim advocates, how are they making sense of prison rape law in the midst of these growing concerns over prison reform? And then second, how are they envisioning what sexual safety means beyond the carceral state, right? PREA imposes a set of policies on prisons, but what does it look like even beyond that for people who have been harmed sexually to think about safety? And so to answer these questions, I really tried to immerse myself in the world of PREA. So I started doing research in March of 2020. I started talking to a lot of PREA auditors, so people who audit these facilities. I talked to victim service coordinators, or the folks that are supposed to provide care for survivors who are incarcerated. And I spent time also talking to incarcerated survivors, about 25 formerly incarcerated survivors, and asked them about their experiences within these institutions. And so I argue that while formal PREA policies may work to reduce certain forms of sexual harm for some people, in practice, prison rape law both underprotects survivors from the institutional violence of things like strip searches, while also over-policing others through zero-tolerance policies for romantic contact. And we'll talk about what that means in a second. So I want to turn my attention and highlight one of the conversations that I had with a formerly incarcerated survivor, mixed-race formerly incarcerated survivor, Keisha, who's a community activist. And I asked Keisha about what her thoughts were on PREA, whether or not she believes that PREA keeps survivors safe. And this was her response. She says, "They literally just traffic us. Nobody ever sees us as victims. I can go to SEG for disobeying a direct order and refusing to comply with that order. So if a CO tells me I need to pat you down, I need to strip you down, I need to strip you step by step, lift your breast, spread yourself, cough. If you're fat, they'll tell you to lift and separate your roll. If you're wearing a tampon, you have to take it out, and they will not have another one for you. If you refuse to comply with being stripped down, you're going to SEG. You're probably going to get beat up." And she ends by saying, "PREA's a fucking joke." And so within these coercive sexual environments, we see that the pat-downs and strip searches that Keisha and other survivors are subjected to are both normalized and justified through carceral logics of facility security. So the sexual degradation within these practices, especially for women, is exacerbated by the fact that almost 80% of women who are incarcerated are already victims of sexual assault long before they got to the prison in the first place. So this isn't just a matter of, well, if we just change the gender of the person doing the strip search, then it becomes less traumatic. The idea is, regardless of that, the idea of having to expose your body, the idea that your bodily autonomy is completely violated. That's what's doing the sexual harm for folks. And that's what PREA isn't really addressing, right? And so a lot of these women, again, are subjected to the very forms of gender-based violence from which the state claims to be invested in their rehabilitation. And so it's precisely because of this paradox that leads many survivors that I spoke to conclude that PREA's a joke. But at the same time, there were a lot of interviews that I did with advocates who are working with incarcerated survivors. And one of the things that they talked about was this over-criminalization of physical or romantic contact between people who are involved or sort of involved in what I'll call mutually desired types of relationships. And so I want to point out a conversation that I had with Blake. And Blake was an advocate for formerly incarcerated youth. And when I asked Blake about PREA, they sort of mentioned the different part of it. And Blake says, "I was talking with some of the girls who had come back, and somebody made a quick reference to this idea of like, oh, now I've got to deal with a PREA charge." And I was like, what? Wait a minute. And that's when I started to realize that the way young people I knew in secure detention were hearing about PREA was because they were being given this, it's almost like they would refer to it as either a charge or a PREA investigation. And it had everything to do with them being consensually involved with the same gender person, right? And so Blake and others talked about the fact that this criminalization unduly targeted queer and gender nonconforming folks of color and was reproducing these cultural mythologies that incarcerated communities are inherently hypersexual and violent, right? All while, again, not eradicating the very real institutional violence that a lot of these survivors were pointing out. Oops. So this leads to some of the, I have sort of a couple of, I want to pivot to 4 key implications for policy and practice. And I want to be clear, very similar to a lot of other folks in the room, that these implications are very much informed by decades of anti-carceral feminist activism, right? Which has sought to both address gender-based violence within the community, but also recognizing that the state itself is an inflictor of this kind of gender-based violence. And in order to be anti-violence, feminist anti-violence advocates, right, we have to also address the kind of harm that the state is providing. And so first and foremost, I propose that the policies and practices that we develop have to be heavily informed by currently and formerly incarcerated survivors, right? So the communities that are actually experiencing this firsthand. These are the people that can tell us what the conditions are that facilitate violence, the nuanced understandings of prison sexuality beyond these sort of consent, non-consent binaries, the consequences to reporting, right? The effectiveness or lack thereof of these various reforms, and again, what those visions of sexual safety look like beyond the confines of the carceral state. And so this was really important to my own research, and one of the things that I would ask survivors is, what do you want me to do with your story? I was honest and transparent about the fact that, yes, these go in publications, but beyond that, what would you like to see? And I remember Nico, who was a formerly incarcerated Black man survivor, he said, I wish that there could be more narratives around Black men and sexual assault, what's being done to them. And I think that we have built a culture where it's dangerous for Black men to be able to say these things because they're perceived as gay or all of these other things. And I would love to see, in addition to, policy and things being changed, there has to be a huge effort putting into play for Black men and molestation and sexual assault, right? And so that's one of the things that I think in this work that we have to be able to address is sort of the intersectional dynamics, because in this case, and I didn't talk about it a ton today, but we actually see high rates of Black boys being sexually victimized. So about 90% of the boys reporting, or 90% of the youth reporting staff sexual abuse are boys talking about sexual abuse from women, right? And these are different intersectional dynamics than what we would typically see in the violence against women framework. So what we do is we have to make sure that the different types of, that we're also speaking to people who've experienced this firsthand. The second part of it is that our efforts should be undergirded, again, by the sort of anti-carceral feminist advocacy. And we know feminism has played a huge role in the advocacy for victims, but we know sort of historically that what has happened is that feminist grassroots movements tend to get co-opted, right, by criminal justice agencies, and that changes the dynamics of the advocacy, so that things that were initially intended to advocate for survivors turn into expanding carceral power. How do we expand the power of prosecutors to sentence more? How do we expand the power of judges? How do we sort of increase convictions, right? All of that is about expanding carceral power. And so it's central to keep in mind to not sort of fall for the same things that we have in the past, and to keep in mind that these movements really should be about how do we get people out of the system. So again, if we're invested in anti-violence, if we're invested against sexual violence, we have to be invested against getting people out of one of the biggest areas of sexual violence that they face, right? And I do want to mention that there's several harm reduction policies that I do think are important starting points, right? So we see a lot of feminist organizing around ending the criminalization of mutually desired physical contact. We see a huge support for ending the use of strip searches and providing more confidential access to rape crisis centers. All of that is important. But an anti-carceral feminist approach challenges us to move past simple harm reduction and to develop ways that we can both prevent survivors from entering the carceral system in the first place and support their release back to their families. And we've seen actually a lot of progress in this in the juvenile justice space and the sort of closing of youth prisons. Third, and it's one crucial avenue that many survivors have utilized, is joining lawsuits and developing media campaigns around the abusive conditions that they're facing. So we're seeing this at Rikers right now. There's over 700 women who've are filing lawsuits against Rikers right now because of the kinds of abusive conditions that they face. And I remember talking to the survivors in my own study. A lot of them didn't know how to do that. A lot of them didn't know what the next steps were. They didn't know who to report to, certainly when they were incarcerated, but even when they got out. And so I think being able to support people pursue legal action and accountability is extremely important. And then lastly, I think we need to support policies and practices that invest in building safe communities. And I say this because, again, most of the incarcerated survivors that I spoke to, including men, had experienced either sexual or physical violence long before they ever got to prison in the first place. And particularly with women, we know with the sexual abuse to prison pipeline that people are criminalized because they're trying to survive abuse. And so I remember asking Yvette, who was a mixed race survivor, and one of the things that she said when I asked her, what did you need to feel safe in your community? She says, I needed an adult to protect me for once and to not criminalize me for trying to survive abuse. You don't have a problem charging me with escape charges of running away from home and locking me up, but you wouldn't even try to protect me and go after this man that sexually molested me, right? And so we have to, for those of us, again, who are invested in feminist approaches, we have to really think about what does sexual safety look like within these communities? How do we prevent folks like Yvette from even experiencing that in the first place? So with that, I'll go ahead and stop, and thank you.
I wish I had so much more time to like process and think about this, because right now I have so many thoughts, and Brittany and I were joking that we actually did a pre-talk like in the bathroom. I was like, we should have just invited everybody into the powder room as we, but I wanted to talk a little bit from a very personal side, because these talks were just incredible. I'm glad we ended with such, because we were all so sleepy. We needed like to revive these. This was amazing. Here's some things that I heard when I was sharing my research as a grad student and as a professor. You can't say that. You are never going to get back into that field site. No one's ever going to fund this research. This is dangerous to you, tenure, your reputation. They will come for you. I think this idea about my reputation, I'll say it this way. My reputation is about telling the truth. I was at a critical race conference one time, and I said there is no accountability in police-involved shootings. They have a blank check, and prosecutors sign it every darn day. They know. They cover it up. They are complicit in police murder. It was a black law professor that called out from the back and says, that's just Chicago. And I said, I paused, because I was like, well, I'm not a law professor. What if I got it wrong? All those ideas, shame, fear, worry, career. Paul Butler's there, right? I want to press him. Heather Ann Thompson, I want to press, right? I'm scared out of my mind. And I have tenure at this point, right? And then I was like, wait a second. Show me the magical jurisdiction where police are getting charged after they kill people. This was before George Floyd. We are gaslit. We're gaslit, and we accept it. And I refuse to be gaslit anymore. And so I truly appreciate talking about this idea of ethos, right? This idea of investigative ethos. And I appreciated, Brittany, in some ways, I was mentoring Brittany, but let me just say, and this is kind of what this network is built upon, eventually she started also mentoring me, and it became reciprocal. So that we were partners, collaborators, and I have a list in my office, and it says, who's got you? And I list all the people who've got me. And by that, I mean who's holding me up, who won't let me get gaslit. I can call them and say, this is a really stupid, Ruben, this is a stupid question, but I found this. What do you think the police are doing? He's like, you know what they're doing? John, do you know what they're doing, right? I need that to be able to continue to see the violence. When you show me what you've done, I can believe you, right? When you show me what you've done, I can believe you. We are obsessed with gazing at the marginalized. And one of the things that I was furious about is, when do we gaze at the people that create the conditions of marginality? And that is what the men from Englewood are doing. Because if Lawrence Relf has taught us one thing, it is that torture is a continuum. And guess what? I asked him this question poignantly. I said, we're supposed to be objective researchers. And he said to me, how can we be objective about torture? Can we just agree it's bad? And I was like, yeah, like getting tased is torture. Getting humiliated is torture. Degraded in front of your community is torture. And so if we know that, those quotes are showing us that torture is not in the past, it's very much the present of Englewood. And I would say the poverty in Englewood, I just drove through and walked through Englewood. A lot happens in Englewood. The intense poverty is a level of torture too, right? I mean, this is, and so I think, you know, one of the things that we need to do is continue asking the deeper questions. So when Brandon says there's 888 officers deployed to patrol Englewood, I want to put down and find out what percentage of those officers have misconduct violations, wrongful conviction violations, are charged with sexual assault, rape, etc. When we say we gave a settlement for $5 million, you know what I'm thinking? Since 2016, up until 2023, $578 million was spent on police misconduct. We pay for torture. We pay for torture. We can't get gaslit. We can't get gaslit about that. When I walk into a field site, I anticipate, if I'm studying up, that police are going to lie to me. I know they're going to lie to me. Because lying is part of the culture. But it's not called lying. It's not called, that's not what it's called. It's called shading. It's called creating a case. It's called other things. And so our responsibility is to continue to peel back the layers of the lie. But to realize they're speaking to us in good faith. They really are. They are saying and talking in ways that will reveal the patterns and practices. I think of Ida B. Wells, and I think that I'm offended every time people just call her a journalist. How many cases of lynching did she have to observe, amass, to show, continue to show? One time Victor Rio said to me, "What's with all the data, Nicole?" I'm like, I have to show and show and show and show. And yet when we do a study of Englewood, we could use 8 boys and just say, well, that's it. And a white researcher will come in and do the whole Jungle Book, jungle trope ethnography, and that's sufficient. But when I have to show something about policing, amassing more and more, I believe we need to start deploying the tools of investigative journalists to start critiquing and going deeper inside the systems, to disentangle the lies. I think Amber's research to this, one of the findings I have is that police actually like to deploy rape threats to scare people on the bus ride to the jail. It is a form of punishment, right? There is no, again, I call bullshit. Right? And you're calling bullshit too, right? The same thing. In Felix's study too, about these actors that are undercutting these reforms. Let's be real. Why are they called stakeholders? Let's be clear. Stakeholders. It means you have a stake in the racist practices that you practice every day. You're a stakeholder in that? Oh. So now my next question is, what's in it for them, right? I need to ask different questions. I need to go deeper every single time. I want to say that we need to start thinking about what the difference is between us and investigative journalists. I would say I do a lot more. I went through a training with Nicole Hannah-Jones because I wanted to understand what she does. But I'm not going to look at one case. I'm going to look at 100 cases. I'm going to go for generalizability because I'm a social scientist. I'm going to do it big, right? But we need to think more like that because there's more there to disentangle and reveal. And I'm going to reveal it layer by layer by layer. I want to end with 2 points here. Is that we all have to normalize fear and support each other through it. Because if you're doing good work that's critical and actually could change things and make people change their minds or be in shock and awe, right? Then you need to normalize walking through fear. When I did research on the waiting room, I actually walked into the sheriff's department with a body mic, and I got his consent. So I say, "Hi, Officer Mazurek. Can I talk to you about release procedures in the Cook County Jail? I'm from Temple, and I saw it like this because I'm not very threatening." "Sure, little lady." Mic goes off because, well, you can get your phone confiscated and they'll just throw it in the trash and all my data's not, right? So there's a lot of risk here. When that piece published, and he admits on there to a thing called the lawnmower technique, stripping people naked, pulling the chain in the shower to make them fall on their face naked, harming their face, like bloodied, right? That's a form of, sexual assault right there. They're naked on purpose to be humiliated, just like they were in Abu Ghraib. And then he says, and I get a call, you never came here. You never came here. There's no such thing as Officer Mazurek. I'm like, I read his badge. I brought in a witness. Brought in a recorder and a witness. And so I said, and I'm scared. Again, I'm scared like when the law professor said to me, it's not real. But I'm now, because we have this community, I won't be gaslit anymore. And so I said, do you need me to FOIA the video of me? Like, is that what we're going to do here? You need me to FOIA the video of me? I was like, do not gaslight me. Don't do it. I'll come for you every time. And I want us to have that fighting spirit because the only way you get to this amazing research and shift this lens is if you normalize walking through that fear. And that's all I got to say. Thanks.
Wow, that was very, very powerful panel and discussant presentation as well. And actually, Nicole, you went where I'm about to go.
Oh.
And in particular, Brittany's presentation, I have to say, really struck me on so many different levels. And to answer your question, what's the difference between us and investigative journalists?
Yeah.
We've been trained to think about structure and think about it theoretically, measuring it empirically, and trying to analyze the causes and consequences of structure on people's lives. And so my reaction to Brittany's presentation, and it also, I felt the same way during Amber's presentation, was that this truth-telling Foucault writes about extensively as Parrhesia. Right, and he gives us the sort of historical arc of the Greek and Roman Parrhesias. And the Parrhesias are truth tellers. And he differentiates different forms of truth telling from, having to tell the truth if a judge asks you a question, your liberty is at risk. That's not telling the truth. That's just you being honest, for instance. Or the truth being extracted from you during torture. That's not the truth. That's you trying to survive, right? But that the fundamental element of being a Parrhesian is having something to risk, right? You are risking it all. And what's so fascinating about this panel and this conversation for me is to sort of think about the contemporary landscape that we're in as academics, as policy analysts, and so on, where if you're doing any work on DEI, anything related to race, you're absolutely right, Nicole. You just gotta embrace the fear. It's because they're coming for us.
Yeah.
In a way that like now your own work is being criminalized and picked over for minor mistakes or citation mistakes to invalidate the very work that you've done, even though it is pernicious. And the fact of the matter is, I'm struggling here right now, and my question is, how do we continue to be pernicious in an age of alternative facts and outright hostility to the presence of women and people of color in academia and in positions in which we are trying to change policy? We are trying to change minds, and some minds don't want to be changed. So what do we do? What do we do?
Do y'all need dinner and wine?
Yeah.
I'll speak to this really quickly. I mean, I think both these comments really resonated with me. Some of my earliest work from the time I started my PhD has focused racial disparities in the criminal legal system, and even before I finished my PhD, I had experiences of people disclosing to me, senior faculty who were not involved with projects, but I later found out were like Federalist Society aligned, lawyers who had some sort of administrative oversight, disclose like, I want you to change this work because it's going to not play well among conservative prosecutors. Like verbatim, just say that to me. And I expect people to think those things, but I was shocked that they said that to me, like that they actually disclosed that. And even going so far as to attempt to tamper with the work, to delete work. Had entire drives of data deleted that I luckily had backed up. But by people who I think directed their staff to like undercut this work in a very explicit way. And walking into police headquarters half the time where you're trying to use the bathroom and the person sits down next to you and their gun is pointing at you because they keep it on them all the time. Right? Like these are, I think, experiences that we got to be ready for. My strategy, and I don't think this is a good one or like a one that I would recommend, right? But I think early on I decided that like I can either like be worried about trying to maintain sort of an alliance with the academy, or I can like be prioritizing trying to generate knowledge and sort of improve policy. And like there's a world in which those things are not in tension, and I think I've been very lucky in that like things have worked out and I've been able to get a maintain a position in academia. But I decided like explicitly that like there's a very real possibility that this is going to not work out well in the sense that I won't be on an academic track. But I know there are communities out there who have me. And if I am working in a nonprofit setting or with government or organizing or doing, I'm still gonna be contributing to this broader project. And like, that's what I'm here for. Rather than like, I could like study finance and stay in academia. Like that, like academia wasn't the goal. But a lot of people it is. And that's like a very reasonable thing to expect to want that to be a part of your core, which is why I can't say that I recommend it, but that's how I've navigated it, is I had to like explicitly decide because I faced so much pushback early, including like people on my committees and not my committees that I ended up with was great, but earlier on, year 1, year 2, there was a lot of lack of interest in my work that was too specific because it was about race, it was about crime, etc. And I just decided that was a cost that I would bear if I needed to, and I think that's the only way I would have been able to do it. So I just co-sign. You got to be ready to walk through it and have people who hold you down when you do it.
We're going to take one more question because I need to take or you can
Can I
answer.
respond to that
Yeah,
too?
okay.
So I really love that question, Brian. Thank you very much. And I really love the synergy between our panel. So I think, how do we continue to do it? One thing I was thinking, honestly, when you were talking is because I'm visual, I was thinking, one of the reasons I love Black Twitter is because of the invention of this you. And I feel like it's like,
What is it?
it's amazing. This you, but I think to myself, and I'm like, but I know so many people that's how you have to think. And that's what I heard as well in terms of what Nicole was describing, what Brandon is researching as well. It's like you have to keep your receipts, not just in, we have to in the hidden curriculum, right? We have to keep our receipts because someone will say they didn't say what they said or they didn't, you have to put it in an email. Like, yes, you did. That's this you. Same thing with our research, because, for example, I had the California, so a particular archive, we'll just say, a particular archive pulled some files and claimed that they never had them. I had a historian email me and said, I'm looking for these files, they told me they never had them. And then I sent back, I was like, it was a this you, I was like, no, they did have them. They just lied. And so I think that how do we do this work? Well, we build community like we talked about, but we do have to you have to keep your own record. That's why I love Kelly Lytle Hernandez's work on Rebel Archives and this notion of keeping an archive for these very reasons, and recognizing that archives come in different shapes and form, and people have been keeping archives and a record in order to come back and have these moments to be able to prove what has been done.
Can I just respond to that too? So thank you for the question, Brian. I think it's a really important one. I think especially invoking Ida B. Wells, right, who was dedicated to speaking truth to power in everything that she did. And one of the things that I think when we talk about Ida B. Wells, and I always assign her in any class that I teach because I think that she's understudied and undercited. And there's an immense amount that we can learn from what she was actually writing about. In particular, the sacrifice, right, that she experienced in her own personal life by endeavoring to talk about lynching, right? So she was ran out of Memphis, right? And so I think when we when we think about the histories of what has happened with the truth tellers, with sociologists, right, we have to remember that they were very radical in their origin, and they experienced a number of assaults on their personal life in order to advance society forward. And so I think if we are thinking about continuing that tradition, we have to be able to put those same things on the line, right? And recognize that it might not be easy, but resistance has never been easy, and it is immensely important to the Black radical tradition in any forms and variations as well.
Did you want to answer?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, can you hear me? One of the things that's also been really helpful to me, and it was mentioned before by Nicole, is this idea of being able to have a community of mentors, right? Having people who you can talk to about the kind of work that you're doing, people that support it, people that get it, people that have been there before. And so I think for myself, that's been one of the key things. I mean, even in this group, we have like a Black feminist writers group, which has been just, it started off as just kind of focusing on looking at our different works, but now it's been really just a space of support where we can talk about these things and what are the kinds of risks that we're taking, what are we comfortable doing, what are we not. And so I think for myself, that's kind of been the thing that's been grounding to me, is talking to other people that are doing this work, especially around violence, because there's so much emotional labor that goes into that. And so really talking to people who get that and understand rest, that we can't just produce, do this interview and do another one tomorrow and do another one. Like, we have to be able to kind of slow it down and take our time with some of this work as well.
I want to close this out, but I got to recognize you guys have been an incredible audience and participants. Each of the panels have been great. I do have to have Chloe stand and recognize her because she hates this. This is why I'm doing this. There was a lot of thought put into each panel, and Chloe participated heavily in crafting these panels and making sure each of you got here as well. So she's incredible, and I want to thank her so much. I want to acknowledge Ivy for keeping us reasonably within our time period. 2 minutes behind. You're not working hard enough, Ivy. Great job, Ivy. Thank you so much. And I'd be remiss if I let you all leave, because I leave before I mention this. Nicole and some other folks have inspired me to embrace my own fear. My fear wasn't outside the academy. My fear has been inside the academy because of how the conversation on abolition has been shaped over the last 20 plus years, where it's been this strong, it's been a strong dichotomy. Either you're an abolitionist or you're a reformer, right? And I think part of why I wanted to call this symposium together wasn't just because I wanted to pay things forward. So I'm full reveal here, right? I got $398,000 through the National Science Foundation. It's $400 for this project, and this project page we just released this. And try and center rural communities of color, especially those that have prisons, and put their voice in the midst of a discussion on abolition has taken me years to accurately and succinctly place that, because I've been told in no uncertain terms. I was on a panel, and a black dude once told me on a panel, I talked about the precarity of rural communities of color, and he said, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. And I think that Monica and a host of others here who are pushing the boundaries in terms of the narrative for what abolition is and how we should be thinking about it. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you guys showing up and showing out. You have given me, this has been a very long day, but I am incredibly energized from this discussion. So go to the Urban Institute, check out this page, you'll see a new blog. I not only work with junior researchers in the academy, I'm promoting the junior researchers in urban, especially those who are looking at work around racial disparities in the criminal legal system. And surprise, surprise, those folks it looks about like this room too, the junior researchers I'm working with as well. So I really appreciate everyone. We have a great dinner planned for you. It's at 6:30. It is the restaurant is, I'm not gonna say this online, because I don't want other hungry people showing up. But y'all know where you're going. It's a great restaurant. We'll be able to chop it up more and continue this conversation. Thank you all, and I will see you bright and early tomorrow morning. You have to come tomorrow because we have perhaps the most important panel, 2 panels tomorrow with community engaged methods. So this is more of the process of getting our work out into the community, and also I want you guys to hear from funders that have agreed to come here and impart some wisdom, especially given the career stage of most of the folks here. We want to hear from them as well. So thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you at 6:30.
No, yours was great too. I need to work on. I was very impressed by your presentation style, your pacing. Thank you. I get overexcited. I try to talk too fast. No, the whole time I was like, this is great.